you want to start with basket weaving or do you want to start with Martin Luther King?
Let's do Martin Luther Kiffin. Let's do Martin Luther Kiffin quickly here, because this is the one that I don't honestly want to spend a ton of time on. Look, you want me to be completely honest with you, and if you're watching this on YouTube and you know what I look like, know what I mean when I say we. We think you're all racist. We just kind of think Ole Miss is a little bit.
Thank you, Lee. I'm Alex Kirshner, joined by my co-host Richard Johnson, and this is Split Zone Duo. We appreciate all of you who are listening to the show and watching it on our YouTube channel for podcast episodes. That's youtube.com/@collegefootballpodcast. One word. My friend, how are you?
Doing quite well. Spent some time in Florida. Spent some time at home. Was at ACC meetings, which we'll obviously get to in a little bit. Always nice to be down in the Sunshine State. Left New York. It was like weirdly, annoyingly chilly, and now it's a little bit better. Spring is weird up here. I'm not a seasons guy, man. Hot and cold, just that's all I need.
Amelia Island, Florida, is the site of the ACC meetings where you were doing some journalism this week. What is Amelia Island's deal? Is it a sea island type of place? Is it like a Hilton Head type of place? Is it like a Stone Harbor, New Jersey type of place? Like, what are we sort of working with in this regard?
Very akin to sort of the Sea Island, Hilton. It's much more Sea Island, Hilton Head-y than it is like South Florida-y or like 30A, Lower Alabama, Gulf-y. It's Amelia Island for the uninitiated, about 45 minutes north of Jacksonville. It's basically what is between Jacksonville and the state of Georgia, or the state line of Georgia, I should say. Amelia Island basically borders it, depending on what beach you are going to or where you're going on a boat, you can actually end up in the state of Georgia. Cumberland Island, stand up. I like Amelia. It's sleepy in the good way a beach town is sleepy. Look, it's pretty ritzy, let's be honest, but it is not like South Florida flashy type thing. People literally live there most of the year. Fernandina Beach is like the sister town or whatever. That's also there. People actually live there versus a South Florida deal where people are coming in and out for like 3 months at a time and snowboarding it type stuff. I like Amelia Island, and the Ritz that this thing is held in is, you know, it's a Ritz, but it's not one of those Ritzes that was like nice in the 1980s or like the early 1990s type deal. Right. That some of them are. Like if you stay at the one in downtown Atlanta for anything, you're like, oh, this was really nice in like 1996 type deal. Like, no, it's pretty decent. And you will, or actually, no, you don't drink whiskey, do you? They do this like smoke old fashioned thing. That's like, it's probably like at this hotel bar that like smokes out the entire bar. It's like a thing all night. You like smell like smoke because of how they do the smoked old fashioned.
Interesting.
But, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of like an old fashioned sometimes. For Christmas many years ago now, my then fiance or then girlfriend got me a cocktail smoker, and I think it wasn't getting enough use. So when we moved, we did not keep it. But I like the concept of a smoked old fashioned, and I'm happy for you that you got to experience it.
Yeah, it was this ACC meetings I think is interesting because this is the first I've been to four? Yeah, I think ACC meetings now in my young journalism career. This is the first one I've been to that the ACC wasn't actively trying to tear itself apart, or half the league wasn't trying to leave, and they were at least unified on one thing for now. Also, by the way, took a pit stop at Gainesville for Mother's Day and hung out with the new head Gator, John Summerall. That was an interesting time as well. Wrote a story about that on CBSSports.com as well. So the ACC meetings were actually, I would say, productive. One thing they didn't do, by the way, is they did not decide on tiebreakers. You will recall your favorite thing, Alex's favorite thing, is trying to figure out this tiebreaker situation with every conference in early November when the rubber starts to meet the road, to the extent that I tell him that I simply will not do it. As we try to put a hurry up together, we obviously try to put the teams that are in contention in November into the hurry up, as real hurry up heads will know. However, that becomes very difficult because pretty much everybody is in contention, to the point that we forgot about 5-loss Duke because why wouldn't you remember a 5-loss Duke team? And you would assume that that team was out of a conference championship game. But because the ACC championship tiebreakers were what they were, Duke obviously got into the ACC championship game this year via just an insane tiebreaker. Alex, I don't know if you're aware of this. I'm sure there are people in the audience who are not aware of this. You're going to have a real party with this year because, and I expect the ACC to have some clarity on tiebreakers probably in June. You know that like half the ACC is playing an uneven number of games this year?
By uneven number of games this year, you mean what? Like they're playing 7, 9 conference games, or they're not all playing the same number of conference games?
They are not all playing the same number of conference games.
Tell me why that is happening.
Yeah, you didn't know this, did you? Yeah, they are transitioning to the final configuration of their conference schedule, in which everybody except I think one school, because it's an uneven number of teams in the league, it's 17 teams in the league. Notre Dame is not a full member, as we know. There's an uneven number of actual teams in the league. So one team will be playing one fewer conference games than the rest of the league, starting in 27, I'm pretty sure. Either 27 or 28.
Yes. This is math.
Yes, this is math. In 26, basically half the league is playing 9 conference games, while the other portion of the league is playing 8. The portion that is playing 8 will play an extra guaranteed Power 4 game, but they are just playing 8 ACC games. So yeah, when we get to this in late October, like we really just need Miami to be really good again and just run the league and go to the conference championship game, because trying to hash this out.
Do we need that? I don't need that.
No, you do. You're the one who tries to put the show together with 95 ACC teams that you pretend are in contention. Again, I'm trying to make this clean on you to put the show together.
I do appreciate that. It would make a cleaner run of show if Miami just went 12-0 next year. Somehow, I have a feeling that the ACC is not going to accommodate anything that simple, because that's not really the way that this conference rolls. But Richard, I am curious what else was on the docket while you were down here at these meetings at Amelia Island. On Amelia Island? At Amelia Island? Whatever.
I think at Amelia Island, probably the way to say it. On the water, I will say. Definitely on the water. The college football playoff thing is the big deal. I think they're gonna expand this thing, and which I think that was said for like a couple of years now. Obviously the two of us are good with 12, pretty much always have been. You could stretch me to 14, but both of us like basically where we're at. It is pretty apparent that they are going to expand this thing to either 16 or 24. And the 16 versus 24 is where, I know, is where the rubber's going to meet the road here in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, Tony Petitti and the Big Ten have socialized the 2014 thing. For a while, they were socializing a version with uneven automatic qualifiers. SEC and Big Ten had extra automatic qualifiers. ACC and Big 12 didn't have as many. That pissed both of those leagues off, obviously, and they weren't on board with the 24 thing. They have now seen the light on the 24 thing, have the Big 12 and the ACC. The ACC meetings were obviously this week, the week of May 12th, as you're listening to the show. Big 10 and Big 12 meetings are next week, which is key. The Big 10 is doing an interesting thing, which is they are making Tony Petitti available next week, as I understand it. Now, I will not.
The Big 10 commissioner is going to defend his disgraceful behavior in public with his own voice.
Yes, Tony Petitti will be made available to reporters next week in Los Angeles, or outside of Los Angeles. You should go. You can't go. You're not invited. You're not invited.
Why am I not invited?
You're not invited because
I'm a Big Ten alum. I'm a Big Ten alum.
No, you're an ACC alum. It's an invite only thing for reporters. Anyway, Petitti will speak at this. And
why would Tony not invite me? I've been so nice to him over the years. Why would they not call me to see if I could come to this?
At those meetings, I think the Big Ten and Petitti will probably lay, I know he's going to be asked, but we'll lay out sort of for everybody where they're at on the 24 thing and what amalgamation of the 24 they want. the Big 12 is in for 24. Yormark called Brandon Marcelo, my colleague, who I co-wrote a story with this week about this whole deal. I called Marcelo back in like 5 minutes when we were trying to report this out this week. And was like, yeah, 12, print it, put me on record. Or excuse me, yeah, 24, print it, put it on record, which he did. So ACC, Big 10, and Big 12, good with 24 teams. Who isn't good with 24 teams and why, I think is where we need to sit at right now. So the SEC, for now, is stuck on 16. But ESPN doesn't want this thing expanded either. And I literally know that because I asked Jim Phillips this yesterday, the ACC's commissioner. I literally asked him, I was like, what is your understanding of ESPN's position? Because I don't really think that's publicly out there where ESPN stands on this.
Can I ask the question?
Please.
Is the reason why ESPN does not want the playoff to expand that they don't want Fox or anybody else to get a bite of the playoff apple? Or is it something else?
Well, I would argue it's a both and situation. Definitely, you're totally right, in my opinion. The other thing is they don't want to pay for it. Like, they just don't want to pay for it. Now, ESPN owns the rights to the playoff if it expands to 14, by the way, as well. They own all the rights, all the games. They sublicense some of them to TNT, as we know. One of which will be a later round game this year. I think it's a quarter, if I recall correctly. But in any event, they license, they have control of a 12-team playoff or a 14-team playoff. If it expands past that, the thing is going to go out to the open market for bid, as you would expect. And why is where I think we sort of answered the question of what's going to happen and why to conference championship games. So as the season is probably going to officially expand into week 0 here soon, conference championship games are also going to be on the chopping block. And one of the most astounding things to me, and it's a thing that I think people need to understand, is this is not just the bureaucratic class of folks that are saying, see a conference championship games, playoff expansion, bring it in. Because we always sort of ask this question, right? Like, who's asking for playoff expansion? Nobody is asking for playoff expansion. They're just doing it. But I do think we need to define the they, because the they also includes the coaches right now. That I think is important.
You're inverting it a little bit, though, aren't you? I would say that the American Football Coaches Association came out in the last week or so and said, we support this. But were they asking for it, or were they persuaded that this would be a good thing? I think there's a slight difference in terms of just trying to figure out why this is happening.
No, so I think the coaches are grinning and bearing it through the conference championship game stuff. I think most of them like the idea of a conference championship game. Most of them will want to win a conference championship game. I think it matters to them. But I think a lot of them are like, if that's what's got to go in service of a 2014 playoff, that also ends the season earlier than January 25th. Like this season is going to end.
Yeah.
It's the best of a bad situation type thing. And the coaches were, to me, I was surprised how on board some of the coaches were on and off the record at this event when you sort of talk to them in the hotel lobby and the lobby bar at night over smoked old fashions, how they were like, yeah, man, if that's what's got to be, that's what's got to be to get to 24 teams. I think the coaches are making a access argument to themselves. And I think the ADs are also making an access argument, but the coaches' access argument is on a somewhat competitive end, especially if you're an ACC team. And the AD access argument is obviously on we need a carrot in order to keep funding this thing, sort of thing. But they are all sort of arriving at the same place.
Let's talk about the access argument, because I have a feeling of what it is. And I've talked to an assistant or two, actually 2 exactly, about what they think of this. The point that's been made to me by a couple of people is that they think it's going to be good for coach job security. if
No.
there's a 2014 playoff. And that's
No
what
chance.
I said. I was like,
No chance.
I was like, are you sure about that? Because I heard that about the 12-team playoff.
Yeah.
And we have still seen numerous marquee college football programs fire coaches at exactly 3 losses at a point in the year where they were, take Penn State last year, for example, or I believe LSU was on 3 losses when they fired Brian Kelly last year. Like, we can all be adults and go back and look. Like, once you've lost the 3rd game in October, you're probably not making it, but you're not necessarily out in that world.
Texas wasn't like ow when they lost that
like
3rd
the
game
day before. Yeah. And so I've heard it before on the 12-team argument that format was going to keep coaches from getting fired, and I've heard it whispered about with 24. I don't think it's true. Do you think that a lot of coaches do think it's true? Neither of us buys it, but do you think that it is an animating belief for people?
I think so, because I think
delusional,
they're saying,
but okay,
yeah, sure, but that doesn't mean they don't believe it.
Yeah,
it's. I think they think it's if we can just get to the dance deal. I mean, Jim Phillips said that he thinks teams 17 through 24 can actually win this thing, which
no,
yeah, that is not happening. But in any event, if you're an ACC team or a Big 12 team, yeah, access is your reason why 24 works for you. Access, and what I do think is interesting, and like I said a little bit earlier, Phillips isn't really married to AQ or non-AQ. If they're going to do AQ, though, he's just he wants it to be an even number of AQs across power conference teams, which makes a ton of sense. The Big 12 and the ACC will not go for this if it's an uneven number of AQs, but they will if it's an even number of AQs. I think a couple other things here. As far as devaluation of the regular season, the coaches, and this is specific to them, are pushing a thing regarding regular season devaluation that it actually increases valuation of November games because more of them are meaningful, because more have access to the dance. That is the party line from coaches regarding the devaluation of the regular season.
I gotta say that I just don't see the world working this way, and I think it's a bad idea. But I also, I don't want to just stand on a soapbox forever on the show. I think that the game theory, if you will, of this is still the most interesting thing, because I think most of the people listening to the show, just like most of the general public, aren't going to like this and are going to see nefarious motivations behind it, where I think they might be right, that those exist. I'm thinking back, Richard, to a question that one of our subscribers asked us for a mailbag that we recorded back in, I think, February, about the Big Ten and the SEC's different motivations here, and the SEC wanting 16 and the Big Ten wanting 24. And I went through a handful of years of history. I think I went back 5 years to check sort of what a 2014 playoff would have looked like, because the questioner had asked, and this was one of our brilliant, wise, attractive splitzonduo.com subscribers, asked, everyone is if you subscribe. And he asked, like, do you believe the theory that the Big Ten wants 24 because Fox wants 24? And that would be helpful for Fox.
We hadn't gone into that. Yeah.
And I want to quickly get to that, because I do think that this is starting to look more and more like kind of an uneven proxy war. Obviously, the ACC and the Big 12 have partnerships with ESPN as well. The ESPN isn't in favor of 24.
The ACC has the SEC similar, not just partnership, it's shared business relationship with their conference networks, whereas obviously the Big 12 rights are split between Fox and Fox and ESPN. Jesus Christ! But Alice, when we talk about conference championship games going away, conference championship games make money, and so the crude calculus here is: do an extra playoff round or two. Does that revenue cover basically what we're losing for taking conference championship games?
And guess which 2 conference championship games are the most valuable for television purposes? Right. What I find to be a little bit damning of the Big Ten's position here, in terms of, are you just doing this for the dollar or are you doing this because you actually think there's a good competitive reason for it? Is that if you look back 5 years on what a 2014 playoff would have looked like, it's actually the SEC that would have been helped the most by that format. If you would have just dragged it out to a 2014 playoff over the last 5 years, the SEC would have had 7 teams a year compared to about 5.8 in the Big Ten. Whereas if you were doing 16, it would actually be a smaller gap between the Big Ten and the SEC. I hate it when this happens because it doesn't confirm my priors. But I think what you're actually seeing here is the SEC being the conference that is looking out for a slightly more reasonable competitive format here. Like if you're going to make a good of the game argument, which I don't think is really what motivates Greg Sankey.
So let's stay here for a second. I'm very glad you brought this up. This is my opinion. This is solely my opinion. This is not a recorded thing. This is just how and I feel. I think Greg Sankey is trying to save the league in a sense from itself here with playoff expansion. Because I think if you start letting more teams in and you get down to, if you're telling me 7 SEC teams get in last year, right? That would be SEC 5 would be Texas, SEC 6 would be Oklahoma, SEC 7 would be Vanderbilt, and if you really want to stretch it out, SEC 8 Mizzou, 9 Tennessee. So that's how the SEC standings went last year, basically. What I think Sankey is trying to save the league or preserve the league from is SEC 5, 6, and 7 losing in the first round, losing in the second, whatever, and this continued veneer popping of SEC depth, because that is what I think is going to happen if you start letting some of these 2 teams or some of these deeper teams in. Now we're gonna have to.
But what does that actually do to the SEC? Why is that Greg Sankey's problem if Missouri gets bounced in the round of 24 or whatever in the playoff?
I think it's his problem because the SEC projects.
It's just self-image.
Yes, we're the biggest, baddest, best, et cetera, even though it's been 3 years since an SEC team is in a national championship.
But it's funny because that's
3 years since they won it.
That doesn't jive with Sankey's current behavior in basketball, for example. The NCAA tournament is I think it matters from if we're talking about how the SEC sees itself. I understand.
The SEC,
we are all adults here. We all understand that football is what matters from a business perspective in a way that nothing else does. But I'm serious about this. The SEC in the last, 3 years has emerged as probably the best basketball conference. And Greg Sankey has been an animating figure, one of the guys leading the push to make the NCAA tournament expand from 68 teams to whatever they decided it's going to be
76
in the next couple of years. I think it's stupid, and it's going to make the tournament. It's going to make the things you don't like about the tournament right now even worse. It's going to make Cinderella situations much more difficult. But that's not the point. But the SEC wanted more spots because Greg Sankey wanted what Greg Sankey wanted was this past year's Auburn team in basketball, in men's basketball, to be in the dance. That's and the football equivalent of that, Alex, is what you're talking. Yeah, but they still want to be seen as the best in the business, and it just means more. If we're talking about self-image, I think the motivation is.
Alex,
I agree, not the same in basketball, but it still exists.
You're missing this because you're missing what basketball is. If Auburn could have gotten in that dance, maybe, and you're more basketball than me, but just in the way the ball bounces in basketball, upsets and runs just happen differently in basketball. Getting into the dance as a basketball team in the bottom of the tournament is a much different proposition than getting in as a football team in the bottom of this tournament. We just talked about this. Do we think teams 17 through 24 are ever really going to win this thing? Of course.
No, I think it will happen.
Is going to win a couple games. That's how sports works.
A couple, but not the whole thing. I don't think any team 17 or lower will ever win the college football. In fact,
I agree.
It's definitely never happened in FCS. Though Illinois State got uncomfortably close this past year. I don't believe it will ever happen in FBS.
What I'm saying is the nature of the game is what makes And it's why this is also why both of us are good with 12. Both of us are good with 12 as a percentage of the sport. 12 teams is roughly 9% of the sport.
Yeah, 12's
NCAA
fine.
tournaments.
I'm
NCAA tournaments.
pretty pleased with
20%
12. Pretty pleased with 12. I think it's gone fine. I don't think that it's hurt the regular season much on aggregate. I think it's cost us some things, but it's in some other ways it's enriched the regular season. I think it's a nice balance at the moment. And I am not perplexed because I know how the world works, but I am annoyed that 2 years into this that we are going to make it worse in the name of the dollar.
But I want to stick here because I'm telling you, there's something to this. If you go back to 2024, SEC 5 is South Carolina, Texas A&M, LSU. Those are imperfect teams, 3 conference losses apiece, 9-4, 8-5 amongst them. Those teams get in the dance. Those teams start losing, and the veneer of your league is popped. Because right now, you can say that those teams losing in meaningless bowl games doesn't matter because nobody cares. Half the teams opting out for the draft, yada, yada, yada. It doesn't matter that, Illinois beat South Carolina in that bowl game the year before, right? Because half of South Carolina's team was out to lunch, et cetera, et cetera. When that happens in a meaningful postseason, it changes things. It is going to change the calculus, the self-image, and how we see the sport. It is already happening at the top end. An SEC team has not been in the national championship game in 3 years. 3 different Big Ten teams have won a national championship, including, by God, Indiana. If you're going to sit here and tell me that the sport has flattened at least at the power conference level, as far as the talent is concerned, which it has, and then you're going to tell me that SEC mid-pack teams are just as good as they always have been, those two things don't compute. Those two things cannot exist. Now, do mid-pack SEC teams care more about the sport than mid-pack to low-pack Big Ten teams? 100%. Mississippi State cares more about college football than Purdue does.
Yes.
10 times out of 10. We are not going to disagree about that. But it doesn't mean, well, Mississippi State probably is better than Purdue, but you know what I mean. It doesn't mean that the SEC 13 is actually, it doesn't mean that Big Ten 13 isn't as good as SEC 13, even though SEC 13 certainly cares more about it.
I do think, though, I have a little bit of still distance from you on Greg Sankey's, on sort of the wisdom of whether this approach gets him what he wants and how that relates to basketball. I do think it is interesting, and I think you've settled on sort of the right frame to evaluate the different motivations between the Big Ten and the Big Ten commissioner and the SEC and the SEC commissioner. Like, I could buy it that the SEC is worried about preservation of a certain self-image, and does that get popped if Missouri loses to a Big 12 team in the opening round of the 2014 playoff? Yeah, I think that's a really good point. At least that is more interesting to me to debate with you and to dig into than talking about why the Big Ten is doing this, which I think is increasingly transparent and not hard to figure out. It's that Tony Petitti does not care about college sports. Tony Petitti doesn't really care about sports. Tony Petitti cares about rights deals. Tony Petitti cares about television inventory and has convinced, or doesn't, I don't know if he's had to convince or if he just kind of is simpatico on this with the Big Ten presidents.
He's had to convince.
But the Big Ten just sees inventory that can be optimized. Whereas the SEC, in a differently vain way of its own self-motivation, has arrived at a different conclusion. But I actually find that way to be a little bit more attractive, a little bit more understandable. Not understandable, but more attractive and endearing than the Big Ten's optimize. How can we increase our media rights revenue by a couple percentage points a year strategy of this thing?
I think I'm not going to say you're wrong in that, but I also think that the Iowas and the Minnesotas of the world would also make an access argument as well. 100%.
Yeah, and I would say that Iowa was in the playoff race deep into the year last year until they lost that game to Oregon. A great program win for Oregon at Kinnick Stadium. That was a great game.
Tremendous program win.
I don't know. Jim Phillips said this yesterday. Jim Phillips said this I might have been to you directly. I don't know. Said it this week at the ACC.
It was in a press conference.
That we want hope for all teams. And that is being accomplished by 12. I'm old enough to remember a few months ago. Richard, I could tell myself.
I'm not disagreeing with you, but what I'm saying is I'm not disagreeing with you. But you think it's being accomplished at 12. They don't.
Pitt was in the national championship race until like late November last year. I remember because I was rooting for it.
Yeah.
Now, did I know that Pitt wasn't going to win the national championship? Yes, I'm not dumb. But if they'd have beaten Notre Dame in Miami, guess what?
I agree with you.
Like, is that not what we mean by hope? Is that not what we mean?
It's not enough hope. It's not enough hope for enough teams.
It's just yeah, okay.
It's the ACC and the Big Ten and frankly the Big 12 teams that are making the hopium argument are telling you it's not enough hope, because what they're seeing is they're seeing the rankings come out and they're still seeing an SEC packed situation in the rankings. They're still seeing Vanderbilt and Texas being the next two out, and they're still seeing Notre Dame not getting in and Bama getting in. Like
I just think they're taking it too far. I remember in the middle of November last year, Pitt loses to Notre Dame to fall to 7-3 on the season. They get killed by Notre Dame. They go and beat Georgia Tech in Atlanta on November 22nd in their 11th game of the season. And then Pitt was still on November 29th, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, after having lost 3 games, having been beaten up badly and looked non-competitive by Notre Dame, the Pitt Panthers still controlled their own destiny to win the national championship the Saturday after Thanksgiving with 3 losses and a pretty mediocre team. And that's not enough hope. That's not the sport providing enough hope that a 8-3 ACC team that is about to lose by 31 points to Miami after Thanksgiving and is still technically in the national championship race. That's not enough hope. That's what I mean when I say we're going too far here with the 24. I mean, like,
they are arguing it's not enough hope.
It's working. Kennesaw State had a higher than 0.0. It was higher than 0.0. Not much, but I think it was probably on conference championship weekend last year, you could have devised a scenario where Kennesaw State makes the playoff. That's not enough hope.
I think they they're making the expansionist argument of we need more situations like that.
I just find this ridiculous. But I don't want to dwell on it for too long. I do think I've learned more about what's going on here from talking to you about it. And I don't just want to stand up here and say I don't like this, because I think most people listening already don't like this. And I think most people in general, I've noticed there's this populist thing, by the way, going on sort of across the college football media landscape. I'm sure there's some flunky somewhere who is backing this. But really, like, I feel like most of our industry colleagues are saying different versions of getting to the same point around this. Like, I have been a little bit heartened that I'm not seeing a lot of people who seem eager to be hatchet men for this in public. And maybe that's because the SEC, and maybe that's because the SEC is not on the side of 24. So you don't have Feinbaum getting kind of a commercial pressure and that ilk, and like the SEC network apparatus to sort of push for this. It might be different if it was the SEC on the 24 side and the Big 10 on the 16 or the 12 side. But I've been a little bit heartened that most of our colleagues are also not taking the bait on this just because it's being explained to them eloquently in hotel ballrooms.
Yeah, I actually tend to agree here. But this is where the basketball expansion is parallel. Because, and again, like, I sort of kind of got into this a little bit. One of the things that they are saying basically is most of the NCAA's postseason tournaments, and we know the NCAA does not run the CFP, but most of the NCAA's postseason tournaments are roughly 20% of the sport get into the postseason. College football right around is at 9%. Again, both Alex and I think that is fine. They obviously want to double that to right around 17 or 18% of the sport having postseason access, postseason competition. But where I think this does actually mirror the college basketball tournament expansion debate is that they're probably just going to do it anyway. And if the SEC, like, it's you can send out your surveys, you can tweet at us, you can tweet at them, we can write our columns, we can record our podcasts. But if everybody's here in lockstep, and by everybody I sort of mean bureaucratic class and coaches class, even though I do believe the coaches are kind of grinning and bearing it, plugging their nose on the conference championship game, but they are still plugging their nose and saying we're good with it. They're just going to do it anyway.
Well, this is how it goes in college sports. You get these people who cast themselves as conscientious objectors to things, and then they just vote for them anyway, or they say, "Okay, I support this because I'm going to be a good team player," and so you get what you get, and that's the situation. Richard, that's a helpful overview of what's been going on at ACC meetings and the college football playoff. Thank you very much for explaining it to me. I want to say thank you to the great sponsors that we have on this podcast. I want to say thanks to Nokian Tires. This is a huge week for our partners at Nokian. They are officially sponsors of the IIHF World Championships hockey tournament getting underway in Switzerland. Nokian's social channels are going to have all kinds of things going on from this tournament. It's the Split Zone Duo Hockey Hour brought to you by Nokian Tires. Richard, sorry about the lightning, by the way.
Tough.
Like, tough. Last week I did the ad. I plugged in the ad after the show. And so I wasn't there to console you about the Lightning getting knocked out with 9 shots on goal by the opponent in Game 7 against Montreal. Very tough. I do feel for you.
All I got to say is that Nikita Kucherov is no Steven Stamkos. That's all I'll say about that. Oh, captain, my captain. My captain shows up in Game 7s. Nikita Kucherov does.
Richard's a diehard Lightning fan. We want to say thank you to Nokian Tires for their support of this podcast and of my actual car, which runs on Nokian Tires. I drive them around all over town all the time. Thank you very much to Nokian. And I also want to say thank you to Homefield. This is a huge month at Homefield. This is Indy 500 month. It is the time for updates, rollouts of new partnerships. Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Chip Ganassi Racing. If you are into IndyCar, into auto racing, you will find nowhere producing more beautiful auto racing clothing than Homefield is doing right now. I also want to give a particular shout out to the Homefield heavyweight tee collection, which has become a stylistic staple for me and my wife. You might associate Homefield, I personally do, with this sort of long history of softer knit, snugger fitting shirts. They still have the soft knit. It's very comfortable. There's a time and a place for everything. But I have become very in on the heavier fabric, kind of looser hanging weight, which feels a bit 2000s to me in a way that is cool again. I'm seeing a lot of it in general around clothing brands, and Homefield is doing it as well as anyone. Are you wearing heavyweight tees, Richard?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm a heavyweight guy, as we understand. I'm not really into the narrow shoulderification of the world right now. Obviously, I'm a bigger boy, and so, yeah, heavyweight stuff, I'm into it.
A little boxiness really never hurt anybody with a t-shirt, and I think the heavyweight thing is doing a good bit of work to bring us closer to that reality. We want to say thank you to Homefield. Go and check them out at homefieldapparel.com. Richard, interesting week for Ole Miss. They weren't really doing much, but they became the talk of the town in college sports this week. Let's take them one at a time. Do you want to start with basket weaving, or do you want to start with Martin Luther Kiffin?
Let's do Martin Luther Kiffin. Let's do Martin Luther Kiffin quickly here, because this is the one that I don't honestly want to spend a ton of time on. Look, you want me to be completely honest with you? And if you're watching this on YouTube and you know what I look like, know what I mean when I say we think you're all racist. We just kind of think Ole Miss is a little bit more. So he's made some valid points, man. And that, by the way, when I say all, I do mean the school that I went to too. Take a look at the helmets that the school I went to wore one time in a bowl game against Penn State. Look that one up. Yeah. We all know the deal. We all know the score with Ole Miss. We all know the deal with Lane never bringing this up when he was actually the head coach at Ole Miss. We know the deal with him bringing this up to Vanity Fair in a Glossy magazine interview that I think he did about a month ago, I think.
Yes.
And then it comes out with this. I tend to think this is in the bucket of Lane Kiffin just saying shit, and also Lane Kiffin being somehow surprised that people are upset at him when he just says or does shit, and wanting to either walk back or not really dealing with criticism effectively. Like, he just wants to be able to like say things and
with
then,
no consequence.
Yes. 100%.
Especially when he touches the stove of politics, especially then, which I understand why he wouldn't like the blowback. Who likes blowback? Who likes that? It's not fun. But I have nothing to add about like the history of Ole Miss. I've talked about it enough on the show. I'm sure that Ole Miss fans are tired of hearing from me, and probably everyone else is too. And we've done a lot of work on like the history of it. I am a little bit breathtaken by the cynicism on his part to try to play this card after he leaves, after having the best years of his career at Ole Miss, and Ole Miss taking a shot on him kind of because they're downtrodden, because they shot themselves in the foot all those years ago and made themselves one of the worst programs in the SEC for a long time. And like, then they gave him a shot. Didn't hear much from him or them about this while he was there.
But one thing,
go ahead.
One thing I actually should note about that, it sort of didn't hear much about it from him while he was there with an asterisk, because I do think some of the SIP stuff, come to the SIP, play for the SIP, I do think that was an attempt by them to sort of distance themselves without releasing it. So I actually, I'm not giving credit. But I am acknowledging. I am acknowledging what I noticed and acknowledging what I saw. Not the first Ole Miss coach to try to do it this way, or an artful way. And by artful, I mean like trying to distance without actually distancing, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also would love somebody to explain the origin of the Fighting Tigers nickname to Lane Kiffin, but that's a different story for another day. Google that.
My only other thought on this, it is great that we live in a country where we all get to pick our own politics. Lane has not indicated that his are necessarily all about diversity, equity, inclusion, progressive fights against racism. That's not really the vibe that Lane has put forward with the candidates that he has sent friendly messages to, with what their justices have done on the Supreme Court. If Lane actually cares about this in a sincere way, welcome, Lane. I think that's wonderful. I look forward to your
welcome to the resistance.
To your woke turn. I think that will be great, and I would love to hear more about it, including your thoughts on the issues of the day, which you seem to be so passionate about. Richard, basket weaving. This was Lane Kiffin made these waves in a Vanity Fair article. Steve Sarkisian was talking to USA Today and said, at Texas, we will only take 50% of a player's academic credit hours. You may be a semester from graduating, but you're going all the way back to 50% if you play here and want a degree. But at Ole Miss, they can take you. All you have to do is take basket weaving and you can get an Ole Miss degree. I want to credit one of our favorite beat reporters in the country, Matt Stahl of AL.com, who called a basket weaver to sort of learn about basket weaving not a particularly easy craft. I just want to be clear. I would bet that basket weaving is probably probably harder than most liberal arts majors that you could take, and a number of STEM majors as well. It is this was a really unfair shot at basket weaving. Kind of recalls when Timmy Chalamet was just dumping on ballet and opera for no reason, and then he got in some trouble for that when he was trying to promote cinema. Sark, not very respectful to basket weaving or Ole Miss here. But while we're talking about insincerity, Steve, have you never tried to get an administrator to finagle something for you for a non-qualifier to play for you? Have you never done that? Have you never done it successfully? Have you never done it successfully at Texas, Steve?
I think that, so the timing of this is what obviously makes Ole Miss people say, are we being personally attacked? I do not think the timing, all right, excuse me. No, Ole Miss, you're not being personally attacked, with an asterisk that I will come back to in a second. For Texas specifically, I think when you link this with the fact that, if you will recall, Will Muschamp earlier in the year, new Texas defense coordinator Will Muschamp, earlier in the year, actually made comments along these lines. When he was basically saying, like, you actually have to go to class at Texas. Like, I don't know why Texas is trying to portray themselves as, like, a Southern Ivy, but this to me has less to do with a fuck Ole Miss sentiment and more to do with Texas weirdly trying to put out there that they are like, you know, an Ivy in Austin. Weirdly, I don't know when this started.
Right, I want to be clear. I've never heard this. Like, we've all heard from various schools that they are actually
Vanderbilt,
constrained.
Michigan,
Stanford, Northwestern.
Sure.
I have and I know multiple men who have been on coaching staffs at Texas. I do not know any Texas head coaches, and I have not talked to Steve Sarkisian. But I have never heard from any of these people that they were in any unusual way unable to get guys that they wanted to play for them at Texas because of academics. I've never heard that one time. Not to say Texas ain't a great school. Hook them, etc. But come on, Steve.
So, okay. So let's put that to the side a little bit. I do think there is something afoot anti-Ole Miss, sorta. And I think it's got something to do with Pete Golding. Not necessarily.
Oh, I like this. Walk this out for me. Is it the haircut? What is it?
No. I think there is a born on third base notion folks in the SEC have towards Pete Golding. I think that's what's in there. I had a conversation about that earlier this week that kind of led me to that sort of assertion. Pete Golding kind of called up by Nick Saban, ends up Saban's defensive coordinator, obviously then ends up Ole Miss's defensive coordinator with Lane after kind of being like put out to pasture by Nick Saban, and is now obviously head coach of Ole Miss after Lane Kiffin left, kind of because they didn't really have another option after Florida ended up hiring John Summerall, because I think Ole Miss was going to take a real deal run at John Summerall, but some things broke the way they broke. When you combine this stuff with the Dabo stuff earlier in the year, there's some animosity here toward Pete Golding and the way Ole Miss is doing business that is part of this. That's in there as well. That I think is very, very interesting.
It's a new money thing to some extent.
Yeah, I think some of that.
Yeah. Intrigue. Definitely. This will go in the Hall of Fame of May college football news cycles. It's just perfect for this time of year. The only thing that could have been more perfect would have been if it would have come out like all of this would have happened a week before SEC media days. But we're in that period where we're 3.5 months or so from football. Spring ball has been over for a couple of weeks, and people need things to discuss. And
that's right.
These couple of coaches have provided things to discuss. Next week on Split Zone Duo, we're going to rank all 68 Power Conference campuses by level of racism. Richard's going to lead that episode, and we're gonna go 1 to 60, whatever, and it'll be great. Everyone will love the episode. I think people want to hear it from me too, obviously. Richard, you're pretty well sourced up in the athletic department at Nebraska, and I'm curious if you have heard much, or if you would like me to kind of lay out the fact pattern first about one of the, I think, maybe more consequential college sports business stories of the offseason that's happening that just kind of came to a conclusion in Lincoln last week, and get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, you have been more tapped in, frankly, on this than I have. I sort of wanted to see this one play out and finish up, and it certainly has. I tend, explain it out, and then I kind of tell you where I ended up at.
Sure. So we have talked on this show before about how a number of athletic departments, and Nebraska is probably the most famous of these, or their attempt has been the most famous, have made deals with their multimedia rights provider. Does their radio, does a lot of their campus branding, signage around stadiums, things like that, so that the Learfield or the Playfly, the MMR provider, can pay players directly, and it can become an NIL advantage. And Nebraska, a couple of years back, 2022 or so, sold its multimedia rights for 15 years, $300 million to Playfly. And one component of that deal with Playfly, the MMR provider, and you can go back and listen to the last, or maybe 2 sports business hours ago with Matt Brown, where we sort of talked about this ecosystem. The wrinkle of the deal with Playfly for Nebraska is that as of late last year, the school and the company agreed that something like 10 million or so, give or take, of dollars out of Nebraska's rights payments that they got from Playfly would basically be spent on NIL for Nebraska athletes. And if they couldn't spend that money on brand deals, on NIL deals, then they would just send it back to the rights fee. So it would still go to Nebraska. And Nebraska was very public about this deal. They bragged about it a lot. Matt Rule talked about it, called it a huge recruiting differentiator. Well, Nebraska earlier this year actually got around, or Playfly, I should say, got around to doing a lot of these deals with Nebraska athletes, spending about $7.5 million on those deals. They were ranging between 50 and 750 large, and they were paid typically in installments January, March, and to be paid June this year. And the athletes were going to fulfill these services over the course of this year. The College Sports Commission is the thing that got set up under the House settlement that takes a look at NIL deals north of $600 and says, this seems like it is, real NIL, or this seems like it is essentially salary cap circumvention. And they came down pretty hard on this Nebraska thing. They saw that they were getting paid $5,000 an hour for autograph signings and pretty generous rates, like $5,000 per a social media post, according to the decision that the arbitrator that ultimately looked at this released the other day. A bigger payment in some cases, just like a flat licensing amount that could be maybe $200,000. But the contracts that Playfly was doing with these athletes were pretty light on details, including like what exactly these activations would be, who they would be for. Obviously. It just obviously looks like it's, I'm not trying to be a narc here, but it just looked a little funny if you're a rule follower. And you're supposed to be a rule follower. That's why we have rules. Now, Nebraska, so the CSC strikes this down. Nebraska, actually the Nebraska players, I want to be specific, the Nebraska players fight this. I don't want to use exactly the word sue because it's an arbitration situation. That's how it's set up under the House settlement. But the arbitrator ruled just in the last couple of days, or released the decision in the last couple of days, that basically the NIL clearinghouse was right. That Playfly is obviously an associated arm of the Nebraska athletic department here, that these deals did not seem to have fair market value to them. And so you can't do them. And so this is $8 million to Nebraska athletes. I am gathering, though this is redacted information, that a lot of this was football, just because we know how these things go. If Nebraska's trying to spend $8 million on non-football players, though, good for them. Very progressive. Richard, what is Nebraska going to do about this, if anything? Because they lost this one pretty decisively, and I have to admit that it does just kind of seem like the system working the way they said it was supposed to work. Like, you submitted some bullshit deals. They said, no, you can't do that. You fought it. They said no again. And what now?
I just kind of tend to come down on, like, they're going to find a different way to get them this money. Is sort of why I haven't really, I don't want to say wasted my time, but I haven't really burned a lot of my time, like, chasing this one down. They will find a way to get their presumably football players this money. I'm sure of it. Now, is it a feather in the CSC's cap to an extent? Sure. Like, I have talked to, like, before the rev share went through, I talked to some, like, real deal true believers, like, really thought we were going to get a hard cap, really thought we were going to get significant penalties. Some of that is because, frankly, I think some of the people I was talking to, some of it is because they worked on these rules and these regulations, but I also thought some of it was just hopium about what those people felt was a more sane day in college sports, and would then give those people more access to a more level version of the playing field. But you and I live in a real world. You and I live in a world where there are going to be a handful of rosters that I do believe are going to touch 40 million this year. And you're going to see a bigger amount of them touch 30. And that's kind of going to be the cost of doing business at the championship level, which you will note is much more than 20.5 or whatever part of the 20.5 you were going to give to football.
I think that it's, without making any big predictions about how much teeth the commission's going to have long term, or what Congress might do, or what the future is going to hold in that arena. Anytime a college sports enforcement body gets kind of a big first win like this, it will raise my eyebrows. And I say anytime, I mean, I can only think of one other time, but we've done history episodes here. We have a Dead Letters episode that you can go back in the feed and find about the history of Kentucky in the time of Bear Bryant and Adolph Rupp. And college sports are just a teensy bit different now than they were around 1950 when this was going down. But the reason why NCAA enforcement spent, I don't know, 70 years being a real thing, like NCAA, classic NCAA Indianapolis enforcement spent over half a century being a real thing, is that they gave Kentucky's basketball program the death penalty, and Kentucky just took it, and it was ultimately accepted. And so people in college sports generally agreed at that point, around 1950, give or take, that, you know, the rules were suddenly real and you would not want to cross them. That had previously been up in the air. We've talked about the Sinful Seven, which were some schools, and we wrote a little book about that back in 2020. Some schools that just said, no, we're not following the rules, do what you will, and then they couldn't do anything. I just think it is interesting that we have a case here where clearly this thing had teeth. I'm sure Nebraska will be creative about how to get money to these players. And actually, I want to talk about one specific way in a second that they seem to be trying to do that. But I think if you are a person who just said none of this will be real, none of the rules will be enforced, currently you should be at least like challenging your priors a little bit on that. I think like it's not nothing that one of the bigger brands in college athletics just tried to do a pretty substantial chunk of cash to its players via a relatively novel setup with its MMR provider, something that if it worked, you know, a lot of schools would try to copy. And the commission said no, and the arbitrator said they were right. I think that probably requires some people to draw up some new plans, not just Nebraska, but others who are watching this as well.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but I also tend to net out what I said earlier, which is they're going to find a way to pay him.
I did see, and this was reported by the Omaha World Herald, that in Matt Rule's recent contract extension with Nebraska, the school paid him $5 million that was attributed to be for basically his personal NIL rights and the rights to his podcast for as long as he's at Nebraska, with the idea being that you could exercise Matt Rule's podcast and his image and make, you know, perhaps more than $5 million in theory, that you could go back and give to Nebraska athletes. I thought this was funny as well. Not funny in a condescending, like this will never work way, but just kind of funny in that Nebraska is clearly going to try a different way to be creative and see if they can get money into their athletes' hands this way. Richard, you and I know a decent bit about the college football podcast ad market. I'd say we know more about that than most people walking down the street who don't think about the college football podcast ad market every day.
Can't believe you don't think about that every day.
I don't know why our listeners wouldn't know that, you losers. But
yeah,
no, we're not the nerds. You are. I have a feeling that Matt Rule's podcast is not worth $5 million in anything, period. That would be very impressive if Matt Rule had a $5 million ad sales operation over even 10 years for his podcast.
But I don't think it's that, right?
Well, it's not that. That's the point. I think
sure.
I think it's definitely not that. I think that Nebraska is setting this up. Basically, I'm wondering if some business is going to just decide next year that, damn, you know where I want to spend $4 million in ad spend? It's this Matt Rule podcast. I just think this is an unbelievable podcast. Sure, it has like less than 15,000 YouTube subscribers, and it's a tough ad market unless you're like the Kelsey brothers right now. But I think I want to spend $4 million on Matt Rule's podcast because I just want to sponsor this thing so badly. And that will be, a company with a Nebraska fan running it. That is my guess about what Nebraska is hoping is going to happen with licensing their head coach's podcast for NIL. And if that does happen, I will be thrilled to revisit it and just like fascinated to see how it goes when that gets challenged as well. because this could be a very interesting creative go around if Nebraska is doing what I'm guessing they're going to be doing with this.
Yeah, first and foremost, look, if you want to spend $4 million, or quite frankly, any amount up to and including $4 million, but not $4 million and $1, podcast at splitzoneduo.com.
No, we'll mark you down. In fact, we'll do it for $2 million. Really? Yeah. I mean,
we are open to negotiate. We are open for business. Again, podcast at splitzoneduo.com. Creative ways to get revenue in the door is what pretty much every program with some semblance of championship aspirations should be playing at. So if Nebraska's going to play at that in whatever way they're going to do it, funky, borderline against the rules of the CSC, weird regarding your head coach's own image rights. All right, man. Like, that's the new day.
Yeah. No, you have to be creative. And it's easier to be creative in a press release than to actually make money being creative. We have learned that a million times in media ourselves. Arkansas is trying something this week. I saw this reported by Christina Long at Whole Hog Sports that caught my eye along the same line, where Arkansas is more or less launching a mini travel agency where people who are going to travel to see Arkansas sporting events can book through this Arkansas portal that they're doing with this third-party vendor. And a cut of that will go to Arkansas athletes. That's interesting to me. I don't know how the economics are going to work because it sounds from the story like they're still going to have to basically just use like an Expedia or a Kayak or a whatever, probably a more advanced business product than that if I were just guessing, and I am just guessing. But, you know, it's basically going to be wrapped around an existing piece of technology or company or whatever. So, you know, where will the savings come from for Arkansas fans who want to use this thing to book a trip to Baton Rouge? Or if there aren't savings, will people do it anyway because they just want to support the operation? Maybe anyone who's going to travel to see a Razorback sporting event would probably be more motivated than your average person to get money into the NIL kitty. But I'm going to be keeping my eyes out, especially over the rest of this offseason, for creative little hustles. I don't mean hustles in a bad way, just creative little schemes. I don't mean that in a bad way either. Creative little enterprise opportunities. There we go. To make more NIL revenue. And I applaud you for trying. In some of these cases, I'm a little skeptical about how it would work, especially if it ever got challenged. But I like creativity and I like interesting things that others are not doing. So shout out Nebraska, shout out Arkansas.
Real quick before we get out of here. It's Thursday afternoon. Jordan Spieth, T2. How does that strike you?
Splits and Duo Golf Hour.
I know you're watching it.
Of course I'll be watching it
all the time.
Of course I'll be watching it. I'm writing a PGA Championship newsletter for The Athletic. If you want to subscribe to that, you can just look that up or it's on my social medias. I am not buying the Jordan Spieth thing. No.
Speaking of graduates of the great University of Texas based in Austin. All right. Have a great weekend, everybody. Make sure you don't sidestep CSC guidelines while you're having fun this weekend. We'll be back next week.